Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to the final lesson, the third lesson of Systems Thinking Principles and Social Change. And it's a delight to have you back. So let me move through what is on offer for this lesson. A reminder about the module objectives that was outlined right at the beginning of lesson 1. Our objectives were to learn about systems thinking and social change concepts, to understand the nature of complex problems and an exploration of appropriate responses for social entrepreneurs, particularly the social lab approach. And today's focus will be understanding stretch collaboration as an approach to problem solving. So we focused on the third learning outcome objective here. And the stretch collaboration. So a quick recap of the first 2 lessons. Just a reminder that lesson 1 covered the definition and concepts of systems thinking and introduced the tool of the systems map, which we'll come back to today. Lesson 2 looked at the application of systems thinking by identifying when you have a complex problem versus a conventional or complicated problem, and introducing an approach to addressing complex problems, when to identify them and what to do. So we introduced the social lab approach, and a reminder that the 3 ingredients to that approach was a collaborative, systemic, and emergent approach. Emergent can also be an experimental approach. And we're going to hone in on one of the ingredients, which is on collaboration. And the reason for this is it's the most difficult, getting people together across a system to work together. So that's what today's lesson is about. So I'll pull up here a little diagram that is another representation of what of the work we've been covering in the first 2 lessons, which is called the holonic nature of social reality. And it's a reminder that systems are subsystems of bigger systems. So all these circles and blobs are within other bigger systems. And if you imagine these as social systems, in other words, made up of people, each person is connected to systems that overlap with other systems. So you can be part of a community, and you can be part of a faith-based community, and you can be part of a parent body, and you can be part of a volunteering organization, and you can be part of an organization that you work for, and these all overlap. So it's showing the interconnected nature, which is called the holonic nature. And the most important point to make here is that each of these holons, these holes within a holon, is a part of a system. Each of these holons has its own purpose, its own function and composition in it, which implies that sometimes functions and purposes are in conflict with each other because they're set up to do different things. So this is an important principle we're going to explore when we look at collaboration. The other distinction I want to make for you is in lesson 2 we really looked at solving complex problems, and in systems thinking there are these 2 distinctions made. Well, there's one distinction made about 2 things, which is that problems can be defined as tame or wicked, and sometimes wicked problems are called messes. And tame problems are, in a way, what we call bounded problems. They're within your realm of control. They occur in engineered and designed systems typically. There's recognized techniques to approach the problem, which is a linear approach, which means you follow a sequence of steps and you get to an outcome. You have an objective solution, and you know when you've got to solving the problem. So has the computer virus disappeared? Yes or no? Wicked problems occur in human systems and have no definite or definitive statement of the problem. Different people experience the problem differently. So let's go back to the spatial planning example I was giving you. Some people will experience the urban planning or spatial planning challenge of South African cities in a way of water constraints or of distance to work, so job constraints, or of housing constraints. And so there's no definitive statement to the problem. There's no objective right answer, and the process of solving the problem is social, not technical. Remember, in the previous lesson we spoke about technical and adaptive responses as well. And this is the cover of a book written by a colleague of mine who talks particularly about the capacities required to collaborate with people across systems, these subsystems, where you have a shared social issue. So how do you work with people you don't agree with, like, or trust? It's very hard to summarize this book in a lesson, but there are some key capacities to draw out, and we are going to focus on those capacities, 3 capacities of what we call stretch collaboration, which is when you have a complex problem. So let's put yourselves in the shoes of the person who's trying to solve a complex problem and take you back to remembering your systems map, which I asked you to, well, actually Andrea had asked you to make sure you're in that system. And think about your attitude to some of the other stakeholders in your map or actors. What often happens is if we disagree, and if we think somebody should be doing something else or the problem should be solved differently, we start to see others as opponents or as enemies because they obstruct our own approach. And what we call enamify, we start to, it's almost like a verb that we use. We blame the other. We sometimes call it othering. Just think about when somebody has really annoyed you. They are the problem person in your system, and how you build up stories in your head about them because of how they're acting. I want to move us then to when that situation arises, when you're in conflict or you're in a system or a situation that is not ideal for you. You have a choice about whether you want to collaborate. So this is a very important thing to say. Collaboration is a difficult thing to do, and it's a choice. There are many other choices that are often made in social systems, and we're going to focus on collaboration. So when we decide what to do, we need to ask ourselves a few questions. The first is, can we change the situation? This is a very honest question to ask yourself. If we assume that we cannot change the situation, we have to ask another question, which is, can we bear the situation as it is? And if the answer is no, we would need to find a way to exit. So think about all those systems you've exited because you couldn't bear it and you couldn't change it. And for example, leaving a job or leaving a marriage. And sometimes in bigger systems, it's things like migration, so leaving a country. However, if people can bear the situation and need to make some social adjustments, they adapt. So these might be minor to their lifestyle or major, like just moving cities or staying in a job you don't like. It's not what you want, but you can adapt. So the final choice you can make is if you have enough control, or not control, influence, if you can change a situation, sometimes you can force your way. This is what many governments do, and powerful actors. And you can look at the microcosm of things in families. Who forces the situation? And forces is the most, in some ways, the most straightforward way to act. Is if you have enough influence in a system, you say this is how it is. Sometimes that's the choices that heads of organizations need to make. I know that there might be disagreement about the strategy, but this is the way we're going to go. And force is sometimes quite important when there's crisis, and we don't have time to negotiate and collaborate. And I'm not going to give specific contextual examples now, because there are very different views about whether we should be collaborating or whether we should be forcing a situation. But I'm just giving you an imagination for it. So, to highlight what I've just shared, collaboration is a choice. And you make a choice based on your place in a system and what you think is possible. So, just as a reflection for this part of what I've introduced, which is the choice of collaboration, think for yourself of an example of a time that you have chosen, consciously or unconsciously, to force, to adapt, to exit, and to collaborate. Just write down a few notes to yourself. This is important because we've got a journal exercise at the end of this lesson, so this will help you along the way. So, to summarize, when we need to collaborate, particularly collaborate with those we don't necessarily agree with, or maybe don't like or don't trust, these are some of the indicators to look for. There are people in our system we don't understand or agree with or trust. We see their values, their interests, or their behaviors as different to ours. We have a sense that these values, interests, behaviors are wrong or irrational. We wish we didn't have to work with them. We are concerned that they will compromise what matters to us most, and we don't see how we can be successful. So now I'm going to make a distinction between two types of collaboration. Now that we've said, right, we are going to approach convening a group of people in a particular system to solve a complex problem. In conventional collaboration, so when we, for example, bring people together for a seminar or a strat session or a big dialogue, often what happens is to find common purpose of that group. And because of that diagram I showed you at the beginning of this lesson, the holonic nature of systems, there are many purposes in a room of a larger social system. And stretch collaboration, what I'm going to introduce to you now, doesn't require one common purpose of what this group is trying to do together. It acknowledges that there are many purposes of the social system. The second thing that's different, as I shared with you, because people occupy different parts of the system, the problem shows up differently. So we don't have to agree on what the problem is. There are multiple problems that manifest in a particular social challenge. The same with solution. Just like that U diagram I showed you in the second lesson, we are not trying to move from problem to solution as quickly as possible. The solution needs to be uncovered by understanding the system and identifying where there's leverage, and there are often multiple solutions. There's not yet a plan to implement the solution, and us coming together at the beginning and developing a plan is sometimes not the right approach, because we do not understand where there might be leverage in the system and what's keeping the system working in the way that it does. And we also don't yet know who's going to do what. This is where stepping back and zooming out and understanding how a system works helps us uncover often unlikely allies and unlikely people that have actually quite a lot of leverage in a system. So, a reminder from the second lesson as well, that stretch collaboration is useful when the conditions for complexity exist. And a reminder what those are: cause and effect are far apart in time and space. No one actor can solve the problem on their own and often disagree. And the future is unfamiliar and undetermined. Nothing like this has existed before. So our current context is absolutely ripe for applying collaboration. So let me break down the 3 stretches for you. The first stretch is what we call embracing conflict and connection. So this is not about agreeing on one problem. It's not about focusing on the good and harmony of the team, one superior whole. Right? That's conventional collaboration approach to this particular form of stretch. Stretch collaboration, the first stretch is to be able to embrace conflict and connection. So let me give you an example. Some years back, I showed you a photograph in the first lesson. I facilitated a process with my colleagues to develop some scenarios for the future of land reform. And we convened people from across the system who had very different perspectives about land and land reform. One of the participants was a very well-known journalist and academic who was very critical of land reform policies and their impact, and writes quite publicly about it. And another set of stakeholders came from the relevant government departments that are responsible for implementing the current policies of land reform. And the journalist academic called me up after the first workshop, and she said, I can't participate. As much as I know it's important to do this work, I feel compromised and I feel co-opted into this process because I don't agree with the people who are in the room. And my coaching to her is, absolutely, in different roles that you play, you do need to be in conflict. It is your job to hold government to account and to analyze what they are doing well and not doing well. And in other systems, like this particular setup system, you are invited to step into a collaborative role with people you don't necessarily like or agree or trust. And it's important that you do both. And once she could own those different roles, she participated fully for the rest of the year. And there were a number of others like her who, in a way, were let free to know that they don't need to move from their position, but they also can play a stretch collaboration role to get certain more systemic issues addressed. So the second stretch is the ability to collaborate by experimenting your way forward. So this has to do with how we advance our work of addressing a complex problem. Typically, as I said, in conventional collaboration, we pull people together to get to agree on the problem and the solution. One optimum plan. So many social compacts and cross-sector agreements start here and don't go any further. And what stretch collaboration invites us into is to identify, after we understand the system, what are the small experiments. Do you remember the Henry Mintzberg slide that I showed you of emergent strategy? There's lots of little arrows. What are those small experiments that we can consistently evaluate and allow for multiple emergent possibilities? So the example I'll give you is we worked with a number of stakeholders in a social lab over a 2-year period to try to reduce levels of violence against women in South Africa. And we had participants from community groups and activist groups, from government departments, from donors, from the Fees Must Fall movement, because it was happening at the time. And they all really struggled with each other. The work of collaborating in addressing violence against women is also very contested. And we finally, after 3 interactions, got to identifying some experiments which they then implemented over the weeks that followed. and they didn't get anywhere. And we came back for a fourth workshop, and there were, participants were like, oh, this is not working. But actually acknowledging that it wasn't working a few weeks into the experiment was a huge breakthrough. And to give people permission to fail, because it allowed for new innovative approaches to emerge. They could test the assumptions that they were using in trying to push forward an innovation in a system that wasn't getting traction. And they completely changed their list of innovations that they worked on together that they're still working on today. And then the final stretch is what we call stepping into the game. And what this means is understanding your own role in a system and the problematic situation. How are you consciously or unconsciously contributing to the status quo? In conventional collaboration, people often come together and blame the other, like if only government would change its policy, and if only we could get the greedy private sector to fund this sector better, and if only we could change the behavior of that disruptive lot. How often do those words come out of our mouths, particularly those of us that are activists and involved in shifting systems? So conventional collaboration pushes to change the behavior of others. Stretch collaboration looks equally at systemic change and your own place in that system, which is my actions and inactions have bearing on the status quo. And I'll give you another third example, a little personal story. I had to do some work with my colleagues on primary health care in a tiny little country called Suriname, which is north of Brazil, which really struggles with a lot of similar issues that South Africa struggles with in non-communicable diseases. And the client was a development bank who asked us to set up a collaborative approach to identify innovations using the social lab approach to addressing some of these primary healthcare challenges. And on the first day of me being in Suriname, I was summoned to the regional office of this particular organization that was the client, the development bank, and the head of that particular region sat me down and said, the collaborative approach is not going to work. We often bring people into a room, they just talk, and they don't actually know what's needed. And our organization has got best practice from all over the world, and we should just be a lot more directive about how we address primary health care here. I started doing what I showed you in those slides at the beginning of this lesson. I started to enigmify this guy. I was like, how can you don't even live here, how can you just come in and impose a solution from outside and force me as a facilitator to try to do the same? He was definitely pushing against a more emergent approach, and my colleagues and I were there for a week to have a number of engagements, and included a 3-day workshop with some key stakeholders to identify where there might be opportunities to innovate. And as I got to know his perspective during the week and where he sat and why he had the views that he had, I was able to put myself in his shoes and him in mine, and him in the more emergent approach. And it had a happy ending this week. By the end of the week, he stood up in front of the group, said this was the best use of time, and this idea was great, and he had a major paradigm shift, but equally so did I. And as much as he was a very annoying, abusing his power in an unconscious way man, I did not try to understand why he was saying what he was saying, and so that's me stepping into the game. That's me changing how I approach the facilitation and engaging the client, as well as him. So that's an example of participating in a system. Okay, so in summary, 3 stretches for stretch collaboration when you are convening a group of people who don't necessarily trust or like or agree with each other is to practice embracing conflict and connection. And there are many ways a group can acknowledge what they're in conflict about and what they're connected to identify experiments and to learn and to fail, and to continue to innovate. So allowing for multiple emergent possibilities to align to an emergent strategy. And the third is that you're part of a system and you need to step into the game and be mindful of how your own paradigms are getting in the way of maintaining the status quo. So thank you, everybody. There is a class task posted onto the group on Blackboard, and it's a journaling task that looks at the 3 stretches, and that brings my voice over PowerPoints to a close. So I thank you all for listening to me, for taking this in, and in conclusion what I'll say is systems thinking is a real journey. It is a lifelong orientation, and it's not easy, and it's not the only alternative, but it opens up your world to a much richer way of seeing how social change can happen. And I look forward to hearing about your experiments in applying some of this learning, and I will be responding to some of your questions on the Blackboard a bit later in the week. Thanks everybody, and have fun.